Companies often have to deal with the issue of location, and the location chosen by a firm has major implications for costs, quality, and so therefore, selection of a location has strategic implications. This chapter will take a look at location strategies and how we could address the decisions that have to be made in that context. The objective of location strategy is essentially to maximize the benefit of a location to the firm, and that benefit could be a cost benefit, it could be a quality based benefit, a response benefit. It all depends on what the competitive strategy is. So, if a company is competing on low cost, then it will try to find low cost locations to locate the plant or even the retail outlet. If it is competing on, say, response, it has to be close to transportation networks and so forth. So it couldn't locate itself so far away from customers that it was very difficult to respond, even though that those locations might actually offer a cost advantage, but it's not competing on that basis. So it's very important that the location that is selected is aligned to the competitive strategy of the firm. One of the most important decisions a firm makes is that location decision. The reason why is because it is a long-term decision. You don't change locations monthly or weekly. You would typically be in a location for several years, at least 5 years, 10 years, and so on, assuming that the business is successful. In some cases, people very rarely change locations. They add new locations. The whole idea of locating a facility has now become even more global because some people will locate their facilities to other regions of the world. Manufacturing plants have been located in Mexico, in China. And so, depending on Indonesia, and depending on what you're searching for, you might very well consider global locations. It has significant impact on fixed and variable costs. Decisions are made relatively infrequently, and that's because of the nature that the decision often involves a lot of capital. And the objective is to maximize the benefit of that location to the firm. So costs and location. So some decisions are made based on costs. Once in place, the location-related costs are fixed in place and difficult to reduce. Determining optimal facility location has to be looked at as an investment. All right. But cost is not always what the decision maker cares about. Sometimes you care about flexibility, response, quality of labor, all of those sorts of things. So some attributes that are used based on innovation, high quality and specialized inputs. So if you're going to compete on innovation, you would certainly consider that. An environment that encourages investment and local rivalry. So rivalry often drives the search for new solutions, innovation. And then, of course, you want a market that is sophisticated, that will value the valuation and the innovation that you create. And then that there's a presence of related and supportive industries. So if you're going to innovate in the electronics industries, you may want to be in an environment where you have parts suppliers fairly close by to consider that. So we've already said that the location decisions tend to be long-term, made infrequently. They greatly affect both fixed and variable costs. And then once the decisions are made, they're very difficult to change. So sometimes you want to locate according to a country. What are some of the critical success factors? We often think about political risk in terms of government rules, regulations, attitudes, incentives, cultural and economic issues, because you move into a different culture that may have implications for the success of the facility. Location of the markets relative to where you're considering locating. Labor talent and attitudes, productivity and cost, depending on where you locate. You may get high levels of productivity or low levels of productivity. The exchange rates are important, and the availability of supplies and communication and energy. Those things affect the country decision. In a region or community-based decision, so if you're within the country, then you look at some corporate desires. So a local municipal government might have some desires around attracting certain types of industries. The attractiveness of the region, the labor availability in that region, cost and availability of utilities. So there are several factors that will determine whether or not one locates. For example, in the case of Nova Scotia, do we locate in Sydney versus Yarmouth or versus Truro? And it all depends on a number of factors. So where are your customers? What are the costs associated with the location? What incentives is the municipal government actually providing to attract you there? What are the tax incentives? And then what are the construction and land-based costs and so forth? So you consider quite a few variables. In the actual site decision now, once you sort of picked an area or region, you could actually get down now to what specific site within that region. And you look at the site, the size of the site, the cost of it. Is it close to transportation networks such as air, rail, waterways? Are there zoning restrictions? Is it fairly close to services that would be needed? What's the environmental impact? And so within a state or within a province, you would consider several of those things. Within an area, such as, so once you decide to locate in Yarmouth or Sydney, where within those locations will you actually place or site the facility? Some cases, clustering is an important factor in deciding where to locate. So you'll find, for example, auto dealers. They all locate next to each other. There's a clustering kind of a attitude amongst the dealers. They all want to be close together. Why? Because customers sometimes are not always set on their preferences in terms of types of cars, and they want to be able to go from one dealer to the next to search for options. You know, two dealers might have the same model, but one dealer has a model which has a few more options attached to it. So here are some examples of industries that have a clustering kind of a disposition to them. Winemaking, so the Napa Valley, for example, in the US, Bordeaux region in France. And the reasons for clustering is natural resources of the land and climate. Software from Silicon Valley, Boston, Bangalore, India. Talent resources, bright graduates in scientific technical areas. Venture capitalists nearby. Race car builders, Huntington, Northampton region in England. So you have a critical mass of talent and information in that area. So you will find quite a number of companies or industries that actually cluster. Theme parks. So if the area is just conducive to that, you'll find a couple of competitors. Orlando, Florida, hotspot for entertainment. Warm weather tourists, inexpensive labor. Electronic firms, northern Mexico, because of the NAFTA duty-free arrangement. Computer hardware manufacturers, Singapore and Taiwan, and so forth. So fast food chains, they usually are sites within 1 mile of each other. The reason why? Because they stimulate food sales, high traffic flows. So near highways, you tend to find a lot of them. General aviation aircraft, so you have Wichita, Kansas, and massive aviation skills. And orthopedic device manufacturing, Warsaw, Indiana. Again, so these guys all follow each other. So when you're selecting a site, how can you actually select that site? What's a technique that you can use? And there is the factor rating method, which essentially just means that you identify a number of factors, you add weights to the factors, you score them, and then after you score the factors, multiply them by the corresponding weights, and then the one of the highest weight is what you recommend. But you still want to probably look at some intangible factors that you may not have considered in your factor weighting. So that is a very common and typical method. So we see here, we consider 2 locations, France and Denmark, and here are the factors and here are the weights, and we score them for each location. In the end, we make a decision depending on who has the largest value. Another thing that you could do is what we call location break-even analysis. Different locations, if you're concerned about costs, will actually be different in terms of their cost structures. So depending on what volumes you're expecting to produce, some locations might actually offer you some opportunities. So let's just take a look here. If we have 3 cities, we look at their fixed costs are different, but their variable costs are also different. So for example, Chicago is very high on the fixed cost side, but then the labor costs per unit is, not labor, but the variable cost per unit is $25, compared to cheaper in Akron, $30,000 fixed cost, but $75 unit variable cost. So you got to consider that in your analysis. And what you will find is that for different volumes of production, the different locations make sense. So we look here, this cost curve favors Akron if your volume of production is less than 1,000. If you go to the next one here, between 1,000 and 2,500, it favors Bowling Green. And then if you go beyond 2,500 units, it favors Chicago. So you just simply plot those linear graphs and look for the crossover points. Similar crossover points in capacity planning. Well, here we can use crossover points in deciding locations as well. There's another methodology called the center of gravity method, which basically says if you have a number of locations to consider and you're transporting goods from a warehouse to those locations like customer centers and so on, then you want to consider what is the cost of transporting the goods to those locations. So it basically makes an assumption that the cost of transporting goods to a given location is a linear function of that distance. So what we try to do is to find a distance that is a location, where the expected or the average distance or the weighted distance to the customers are actually minimized. So what you do is you place the existing locations on a grid, all right, and then you maintain the relative distances. You calculate the XY coordinates for the center of gravity, and then the cost assumes that the cost is directly proportional to the distance and volume shipped. And so if we could identify, we would identify the X coordinate of our location and the Y coordinate as follows, where we would have to pick this location X and the distance from that location multiplied by the weight or the volume of product that we will move to the customer from that location is what we determine here, and then of course we divide by QI. So in a sense, the Q, the volume, is really a weight. So we multiply it by its weight, and then this is the sum of the weights right here. Okay? And so in this case, once we compute these two values, we will get the coordinates of the center of gravity for this problem. So here's an example. If we have these four locations right here, we have the coordinates. We simply take here's the volume that we generate, that each area would require. And so now we're going to use this weighting scheme where we're multiplying all the X coordinates by the corresponding quantity, all right? And then we divide by the sum of the weights. So we get the X coordinate, which is 66.7, Y coordinate 93.3, and we have, here's our solution right here, where this is the center of gravity. This is the location that should minimize your transportation costs. There are some other approaches that we could use, fancy approaches. For example, a transportation model in linear programming. So if you have a number of suppliers and a number of customers, then you want to ship from the suppliers to the customers. It tells you, the solution of that problem will tell you exactly how much to ship from one supplier to the customers. Now, if you only had to select among just one location, you would set up the problem like a transportation problem, but then you would have to have a constraint that says only one of the locations would be selected. That becomes what we call a plant location problem, which has some interesting complexity beyond the scope of our course, but it is quite an interesting problem to solve. So how do we deal with locating services? A number of factors we consider is, of course, the purchasing power of the customer drawing area. So depending on who the customers are in that area and the ability to purchase the product or the service that you're selling, The service and image compatibility with the demographics of the customer drawing area. So in other words, essentially, what is the image that you want to portray? And if you are a high-end service provider, your brand image is one of providing high-end services, you certainly would not locate in a working class neighborhood. So the two things are incompatible. The amount of competition in the area, the quality of the competition, the uniqueness of the firm's competitors and locations, the physical qualities of the facilities and the neighboring businesses, the quality of management talent available, and the operating policies of the firm. These are all factors that you would consider. And so there are a number of different types of strategies. So you could either be revenue focused or cost focused. And so revenue focus, you look at the volume revenue, the drawing area, you look at things like the drawing area, the purchasing power, competition, advertising. Or you could look at the physical quality, parking, access, security, lighting, appearance, and so on. Cost determinants would be things like rent, caliber of management, the operating policies, and so on. And then we have on the goods producing side, in terms of a cost focus, you're focusing on tangible costs such as transportation, raw material, shipment, finished goods, storage and retrieval, taxes, labor, and all of those things. The intangible costs have more to do with, is this a highly unionized area? What is the quality of life in the neighborhood? The quality of education, because it will determine to what extent you can attract people to work for you. The quality of the state and local government, whether or not people feel confident about that state and government. You have some techniques that can be used. So on the service retail side, we have regression models to determine the importance of various factors. Once you ascertain the importance of various factors, you use those factors in your factor weighting model. The factor rating method, traffic counts, demographic analysis of the area, purchasing power, center of gravity, geographic information systems, right? Whereas on the goods production side, we can get into the transportation method, factor rating as well, location break-even analysis, and crossover charts, right? So these are some techniques that we can use to select locations in the case of services and in the case of goods. So just to recap, location is a strategic issue because typically location decisions are not made they're not made frequently. There's a long-term implication for the location decision. And so as a result of that, because when that decision is made, there's some costs that are associated with that becomes fixed, that are not easy to change, one has to think of the long-term implications of any location selection. There are a number of methods for services and for manufacturing or product types of organizations. And these techniques could help us decide what is the optimal location that will meet the strategic needs of that organization.